very happy to host Dr. Alicia Campi today and to introduce her new book, Mongolian Foreign Policy, Navigating a Changing World. The books are available at our front desk for sale today at a discounted rate, I might add. So please do grab them while they're here at KAI. Some people might be curious why the Korea Economic Institute is hosting an event on Mongolia. But relations between Korea and Mongolia come quite intuitively to both students of history and practitioners of foreign policy who are among us today. After all, it was the transition from Mongol Yuan to the Ming Dynasty in the 14th century that prompted a regime change in the Korean Peninsula that gave rise to the Joseon Dynasty. More recently, in the 1930s, it was the Japanese Empire's pursuit of natural resources in northern China and in Mongolia that transformed Korea from an agricultural outpost of the Japanese Empire into more of an industrial one. And today, when President Moon Jae-in of South Korea speaks about using North Korea as a land bridge to connect the economic opportunities in Eurasia to South Korea, Mongolia is definitely and certainly part of that vision. And conversely, while I think many conversations about Mongolia's foreign policy begin and end with Russia and China, I think Dr. Campi's new book provides insights on how Ulaanbaatar, to some degree, reciprocates South Korea's visions towards a broader and more integrated Eurasian economic union. So it is a particular blessing and an honor to have the author, Dr. Alicia Campi, with us today. Among Mongolian watchers, she requires no introductions. She is the president of the Mongolian Society and adjunct professor within the Asia program at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. A veteran of the US State Department Foreign Service, Dr. Campi has published over 100 articles and book chapters on contemporary Chinese, Mongolian, and Eurasian issues. And we are very much looking forward to reading her new book and discussing it today. She's joined today by KAI Vice President Mark Tokola, who will be serving as today's discussant. A veteran of the US State Department Foreign Service himself, he's best known among Korea watchers for being the Deputy Chief of Mission at the American Embassy in Seoul, but he has also served in many postings around the world, including as Deputy Chief of Mission at the American Embassy in Ulaanbaatar. I'm overjoyed to have them both join the conversation. With that, I'll turn to Dr. Alicia Campi.
Thank you very much, Young Kwan, and especially I want to thank the Korean Economic Institute and the Vice President, Mark Tokola, for arranging this book launch and lecture by me here. It's a very appropriate place, which emphasizes the close connection between contemporary Mongolia and South Korea today. So I'm very honored to be here to talk with you. My book, Mongolia Foreign Policy, examines the foreign policy, including the foreign economic policy of Mongolia in the democratic era since 1900. The analysis is framed through an integrative approach that emphasizes the Mongolian perspective for researchers and students of Sino-Russian, Mongolian, as well as Northeast Asian and Eurasian studies. It focuses on geopolitics, the defining of circumstances which a nation will always act to protect its national interests. As Ambassador Stobdan of India has noted, Mongolia's strategic position at the cross-junction of Central Asia, Northeast Asia, Far East, China, and Russia attracts major powers towards it. Although Mongolia traditionally has not been a key country for the United States, it has played a linchpin role in Russian, Chinese, and Japanese strategic views about Northeast Asia for many decades. The United States, as the remaining superpower at the end of the Cold War, became involved in Mongolia mainly because this landlocked, former Soviet satellite, was seen as an experiment in the simultaneous dismantlement of 70 years of socialism, inculcation of democratic values, and development of a free market economy. However, my book explores not just Mongolian relations with the US, but its deep connections to Japan, the Koreas, India, Europe, and of course its two border neighbors, China and Russia. So before I go into some detail about the book's analysis, I want to first make a comment that I'm very lucky to have good friends who know the English language very well and are very tolerant of me, because I had two co-editors of this book who read every word and corrected any misspellings and checked the 1,000 plus endnotes. And these co-editors are here today. Dr. David Cohen, who is also a former Foreign Service officer from public diplomacy area, and our mutual good friend, Mrs. Ruth Kurtzbauer, who also served mainly in China Post, but also in some Eastern European and the Philippines, and also read every single word of this book. And let me tell you, if you're an author and you have to pay people to check your punctuation, a lot of times those people don't do a good job. And these two people really knew the English grammar and punctuation. So sometimes their corrections made me remember that I'm not perfect, but because of them, I have a very fine book, and I do thank them very much. So go out and make yourself some good friends who will be your free editors for all your publications. And also, I want to especially single out, over here we have Mike Senko, who was the chargé d'affaires in Ulaanbaatar when I served there in the embassy in 1990. And it is he who shepherded our very small community through Mongolia's transition and witnessing to the ending days of the communist government, and through the protests, but the peaceful protests which led to a modern Mongolian democracy. So I'm very honored that Mike, also retired Foreign Service officer, is here to me today. And he was ambassador in Marshall Islands. So go to Mongolia. Your career can be made, such as these two gentlemen prove us. All right, now, this is the position of Mongolia. It's a landlocked country. It's only has two neighbors, two border neighbors, Russia and China. And Stalin made sure that it just 10 kilometers away from Kazakhstan. It doesn't have a direct border. So the basic concepts of the book are centered around 5 particular points. The first is that Mongolia has its own strategy for economic and social development that is tightly tied to its historical experience and view of national security, and not similar to that of other Northeast Asian nations. The second point, in the democratic era, beginning in 1990, it abandoned the previous centuries' long strategy of depending on one or the other of its border neighbors for a national security policy of diversification or developing connections to what Mongolia called third neighbors. Point 3, concurrently, the government chose to strengthen national security through glorification of its imperial past, represented by Genghis Khan, and reconnecting national identity to its nomadic heritage, even though at that time and today, more than 50% of the people were not nomads. The fourth point was that Mongolia's foreign policy is best understood as mirroring the concerns of its foreign counterparts, while actually pursuing its own strong, consistent goals. So this is important. I don't believe Mongolia lies or fabricates its interests when it's talking to Russia or to the United States or to France or to South Africa. But it has become used to developing a strategy of, if the United States is interested in human rights and transparency, we're happy to talk about that. But do you think they talk about human rights and transparency with Russia? No. They talk about issues of importance to Russia. And the fifth major point is Mongolia's foreign economic policy, deemed the wolf strategy, is flexible to embrace many kinds and types of partners, but fundamentally is anti-Chinese. So with these major ideas in place, we see that in the 1990s, after decades of isolation from the economic development of most of their Asian neighbors, Mongolian policymakers expected that their nation would benefit from integration into the booming Asian regional market. They believed that maintaining national political security was of paramount importance and recognized that abandoning their traditional reliance on either Russia or China for protection was a new and potentially dangerous strategy. This made Mongolia consider the development of a different kind of foreign policy strategy, which has been called the third neighbor policy. This third neighbor title was first proposed by then U.S. Secretary of State James Baker in 1990 as a way for Mongolia to balance the tendency of its two border neighbors to establish control over Mongolia's international and domestic politics and economy. So here in the 1990s, for example, as Mongolia is transitioning into a free market and a democratic society, were, from their point of view, the most important third neighbors that they wanted to establish ties with. And you can see particularly important in this were the United States, Japan, and South Korea. The book traces the evolution of the third neighbor strategy over the years and explains that, in fact, it is a flexible, multi-pillared foreign policy which rationalizes strong ties to industrial advanced nations to the east and to the west, including the United States, Japan, South Korea, and other European countries, in order to consolidate best practices and accelerate Mongolians' transition into the global market economy. But after 2010, Mongolia decided that the third neighbor policy didn't need to be changed, but in effect needed to have a new series, an additional series of partners added. So the definition of which country and was reinterpreted, reflecting the existing economic and political situation which had developed in the 21st century. So new partners have emerged for Mongolia in this decade, including India, Brazil, Kuwait, Turkey, Vietnam, and also Iran. Nevertheless, the Mongols have always emphasized that their approach to economic and political security meant that China and Russia rightly should be accorded top priority in their foreign policy and strategy and relations, based upon the principle of a balanced, stable, but not necessarily equally distant relationship, and that they expected their main trade partners and investors would be these two neighbors. In 2014, Mongolian policymakers decided to recast this third neighbor relationship with the two major powers under a neighbor trilateralism concept in order to take advantage of Sino-Russian rapprochement. However, it is crucial to understand that in this special trilateralism relationship that Mongolia today has with Russia and China, the Mongols remain very wary of China and much more sympathetic towards Russia. In the realm of foreign economic affairs, my book recounts the different stages Mongolia has experienced, beginning with the tumultuous first decade of democracy in the 1990s, which had to rely on substantial overseas donor assistance, ODA, to prop up the transition process. The new millennium saw Mongolia, with foreign expert advice, readjust its macroeconomic plans towards reliance on foreign direct investment, especially in rich energy minerals. Mongolia's international image increased significantly in the third decade of democracy under a president named Elbegdorj, with the rise of Eurasian continentalism epitomized by various multilateral integrative economic and transportation strategies. The slowing, often these strategies are called Silk Road initiatives. South Korea offered one, and of course we're familiar with China's Belt and Road Initiative. But more recently, fluctuating world commodity prices, the slowing Chinese economy, and Mongolia's vacillating legal environment for foreign investors have led to a retrenchment period. Still, Mongolia's extensive $1.3 trillion worth of mineral resources are real, and it is expected in the next several decades they will generate much wealth. Mongolia's transition from communism was especially difficult if one understands that Mongolia, unlike Eastern European nations, did not have the underpinnings of a modern nation state to rediscover and build upon. Mongolia's heritage is that of a nomadic economy of herdsmen loosely controlled externally by a distant Manchu Chinese imperial system for 300 years, domestically governed by a princely class dating back to Genghis Khan's Mongolian Empire of the 13th century. And then it was followed in the early 20th century by a Buddhist Lamaist religious government headed by a Dalai Lama-like religious leader. These kinds of experience are very different than Mongolia's Asian neighbors. And thus, when we look at Mongolia's ability to write and embrace a modern constitution in January 1992 with representative parliamentary democracy that has been flexible enough to guide the country through great domestic and global changes in the past 30 years, it's really a modern miracle comparable to the U.S. Founding Fathers' Constitution. One of my key premises is that preserving Mongolia's heritage is an important consideration in the exercise of Mongolia's national security policy. And an explosive element of domestic politics is the desire to develop a modern definition of Mongolian culture and identity that will guide the nation in the 21st century. Sustaining Mongolian cultural traditions, including pastoralism, is intertwined with the ideology of present-day Mongolian nationalism. Mongolia today is a post-communist society and often, mistakenly, has been compartmentalized as very similar to Eastern European and Central Asian countries. While the bureaucratic structures and central planning aspects are in fact copied from the Soviet model, These elements alone do not adequately explain Mongolia's attitude toward its socialist past or its present policies. For example, most of the countries that emerged from the shadow of the Soviet experience retain a very anti-Russian attitude. Mongolia does not have any anti-Russian attitude. In fact, it prefers Russians to Chinese by far. So it has a different mentality because it had a different experience in the Soviet period. With the dismantling of the socialist economy and its public sector in the first decade of the democratic era in the 1900s, the country's artificial and fragile industrial economy collapsed, which forced a rapid return to the traditional nomadic economic lifestyle for tens of thousands of Mongols. Western economists, mimicking their Soviet predecessors, advised the Mongolian government in the 1990s to utilize development models that did not include the traditional style of nomadic herding economic production. Rather, they saw nomadism as proof of poverty. During this period, many Mongolian researchers and development planners were concerned about the appearance of two distinct societies, one traditional and nomadic, and the other sedentary and urban. I'll give you some statistics. In 1989, about 29% of the Mongolian population were herders, although living in collectives, herders in the countryside. By the year 2000, after the collectives and communes had been dismantled and Mongols were allowed to choose their own form of economic livelihood, but no government support, particularly of countryside agricultural or cattle raising activities, the percentage of nomads in the Mongolian society increased to 48%. So nomadism was a choice that Mongols made for economic survival. Today, it's down to about 43%. The divide between the two societies, the countryside rural and the urban, was straining Mongolian political cohesion. And rural poverty, especially as foreign advisors looking at people who live in tents and move with animals must necessarily be poor, stimulated an immigration of Mongolian population to the capital city, so that today 1/2 of the people of Mongolia live in the capital Ulaanbaatar, which is not a healthy situation. However, the herders did not stay silent. In the mining areas, rising political activism of nomads forced Mongolian leaders to be responsive to their opinions about economic development, questioned the role of foreign direct investment in the country's future, and increasingly, their activities destabilized the country's foreign investment legal regime. What that means is the parliamentarians elected by the countryside people kept reneging and revising in foreign mining laws for foreign investment and other kinds of investment in response to the demands of their rural constituents. So this meant the mining environment kept changing and the laws of Mongolia kept changing, which was disconcerting for the central government and for the foreigners, but it actually an example of a vibrant and thriving representative democracy. Pastoral nomadism, while in many ways distant from the realities of modern Mongolian city dwellers, continues to capture the national imagination and differentiates Mongols from other Asians. This is why understanding the relevance of the nomadic tradition is still the key to comprehending the Mongolian psyche and Mongolia's deeply held principles about national security. And I devote a chapter to soft power and how Mongolia has developed nomadism, nomadic heritage, Chinggis Khan as part of the branding of Mongolia and the promotion of Mongolian power in the globalized marketplace. My book discusses the fact that part of the national security strategy, Mongolia has learned to adopt a more proactive foreign policy instead of just waiting for the two big neighbors to make decisions for them. It's interested in enhancing its global image, and it feels it should seek a more stable regional security framework, which is why the Korean Peninsula is important to it, because it will enhance its own economic development. Mongolian foreign policy and foreign economic relations in the democratic era since 1990 have undergone various ways of development. These stages have proceeded under peaceful and constitutional mechanisms, despite serious economic crises and national security pressures. In the book, I explore the roles of the foreign community, diplomats, businessmen, non-governmental experts, and the impact of globalization in the process. Domestically, the country has developed political pluralism and a multi-party system, while internationally, its membership in the IMF, World Bank, ADB, and WTO have stimulated integration into the global marketplace. I wrote this book because present-day observers of Mongolia often question where is the country heading and emphasize the shortcomings while failing to appreciate the complicated situation Mongolia's democratic, political, and economic institutions have confronted. In 1992, the second U.S. ambassador to Mongolia, Joseph Lake, proclaimed, quote, "This is a place where Americans, if we believe what we say about democracy and free enterprise, can affect the future. The Mongolians are now trying to restructure their economy and their government on the basis of ideas we believe in. If they succeed, this country as an island of democracy could be very important to the world." End of quote. Ambassador Lake's words can be seen as prophetic because it is irrefutable that Mongolia stands today as the greatest success story in Central Eurasia for economic, political reform, and development among the nations nations emerging from the Soviet system. Now, because we're at KEI, I put together some information about Mongolia's relationship with South Korea, which I think may be of interest to you. So first of all, you see that actually they established diplomatic relations late after the fall of the Soviet system because Mongolia had very close relations with the DPRK. Today, and actually for more than 15 years, South Korea has been the largest employer of Mongolian workers, and thus it has played an important part in remittances sent by these workers back home to their families. The Republic of Korea buys Mongolian products, mainly minerals such as gold and copper, but the projected trade commodities, if we can solve certain problems involving North and South Korea and improve some transportation linkages, which are already moving forward, other minerals, particularly in copper, particularly coal, and potentially uranium would be of interest for South Korea. Bilateral trade in 1990, you can see, was extremely small, 2.7 million. And the latest statistic I got from 2014 shows that this trade has increased to 370 million. So although the amount is still not extremely large compared to South Korea's trade with Japan or South Korea with China or with the US. Nevertheless, the percentage of increase is very significant. In 2014, South Korea was the fourth largest trade partner for Mongolia, and it also is very involved in the apparel, meaning cashmere knitwear sector. A foreign trade agreement, free trade agreement with South Korea is under discussion, and it likely will go forward. And finally, you can see these are some major projects involving Eurasian integration, involving energy and hydroelectric power, which involve both Mongolia as the source or the center of these plans, providing different modern electric power generation to neighbors that are in need of it. This also is a graph that shows exports of Mongolian exports to South Korea, and you can see that we had a boom period in 2015, but then when Mongolia had an economic crisis and its debts were called in, things crashed in 2016, but again now in 2018, the trade has revived considerably. So although the country has had its ups and downs over the past nearly 30 years, the direction the country follows has been toward greater human and economic political freedom. Mongolia's nuclear weapons-free policy remains a significant component of its multi-pillar foreign policy that has contributed to maintaining peace and stability in the Northeast Asian region. This strategy, together with international support for the consolidation of Mongolia's democracy via the third neighbor principle, is the mainstay of modern Mongolian foreign relations. Mongolia has declared its territory a nuclear-free zone and maintains strong relations with the two Korean states, its border neighbors, Japan, the European Community, and the United States. Mongolia's vast mineral resources have been viewed as a stimulus to economic growth and wealth for the nation. But the 21st century has already seen boom and bust as Mongols have struggled with managing world mineral prices, foreign monopoly of the economy, because China now controls 89% of all Mongolian foreign trade. And in 1989, the Soviet Union controlled 93%. So they have, in effect, in the democratic era, transferred the monopoly over their economy from one border neighbor to another. They aren't happy about this, but this is what has happened, despite the policies of Western researchers and advisors. And this, how this happened is explained in my book. So I remain, nevertheless, very optimistic about Mongolia. The Mongols and their policymakers during the last quarter century have reacted with much flexibility and resiliency to the complicated internal and external environment they have faced. Despite the many challenges, Mongolia's democratic, political, and economic institutions have grown stronger. There is good reason to hope that the future of Mongolia will be bright and that the nation will continue its development into an Asian powerhouse in the succeeding decades. So I think most of you know that at the very beginning of August, Mongolian President Batulak came to the United States on a state visit and met with President Trump and had extensive meetings with members of the Trump administration. Mongolia regards such symmetry as very important, and it is an example of a second trilateral relationship which it has developed called democratic trilateralism, that is to balance the trilateral relation between Mongolia, Russia, and China with a democratic trilateralism between Mongolia, United States, and Japan. So this was something proposed initially to the Obama administration. They weren't so interested in this concept, but the Trump administration has shown great interest in having Mongolia be a bridge, as we know, in North-South Korean Peninsula discussions, informal discussions, and that is why during the president's visit, the United States and Mongolia established a strategic partnership level relationship, foreign policy relationship, which especially on the Mongol side, they considered to be very important and helpful to them as they try to manage their difficult relations, foreign relations within their region. So I thank you very much and look forward to the discussants' points and questions.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Campi. It's a very comprehensive presentation, a lot in there to think about. I'm not sure experience in Mongolia is necessarily a great career move. I mean, it did lead to an ambassadorship for Mike Senko, but seems not to have saved John Bolton. A discussion is supposed to provide a critical analysis of the book, and my critical analysis is I love this book.
Excellent.
I don't know anything else on the market that quite does it the way she does. It's the book on Mongolia right now, clearly. It's a story worth telling. Mongolia is interesting in itself, but it might have lessons to teach other countries. North Korea, if you're listening, there might be some lessons to learn from Mongolia. And Mongolia is important in its own right, as an important country in an important region, Northeast Asia. For those of you who don't do taxonomy, the United Nations considers Northeast Asia to be North Korea, South Korea, Japan, China, Russia, and Mongolia. So that it is clearly part of the Northeast Asia region. I also thought reading the book would be a great standard textbook for economics. People teaching development economics can learn a lot about how to use natural resources as part of a development strategy. It's a great case book on that issue. I thought one of the book's great strengths was it's so fair and even-handed. It's easy to be prescriptive, to say that Mongolia should keep distance from China, or should embrace foreign investment in the mining sector, or should protect nomadism. It's such a deep part of the culture. But I thought you very fairly laid out the pros and cons of all of the issues that face Mongolia. And my overall impression from the book, which I hadn't really thought about before reading it, was that Mongolia has not had a predetermined path to follow since 1990. It's had to make a series of choices and calibrations, beginning with where to fit in the world. Is it part of Central Asia or Northeast Asia, or equipoised between China and Russia? And since then, it's had to make other choices about the degree to which it would accept foreign investment, how it reach out to third neighbors and who they should be, how much to accommodate China. And it's had to continually calibrate in the midst of unpredictables such as the world commodity prices. So I think mistakes have been made, and you point those out in your book, but on the whole, I think Mongolia has done a remarkable job of calibrating all of those issues over time. Okay, I'm not sure if discussants are supposed to ask questions. I've got a few. I'm going to ask you anyway. I know the book's about foreign policy, so I can't fault it for not going into depth about domestic Mongolian politics. Maybe you can do some of that here. So first, you touched on it, but how entrenched is democracy in Mongolia? Do the opposing political parties accept that taking turns being in opposition is a normal state of affairs? And do Mongolian voters think that the parties reflect their views? Let's start with that, and I'll do one by one.
Thank you very much for your comments, and thank you in advance for your questions. I think. I haven't heard all your questions, but you may have added to the list. You can't talk about Mongolian foreign policy without touching on the domestic situation, and that's particularly true when we're looking at how the country transitioned via very generous donor assistance policies. Mongolia in the 1990s received more donor assistance money, foreign aid, per person than any country in the world. That includes Haiti and all countries in the Middle East, everything. So Mongolia was treated very well by the donor countries, and they learned to play that game. So that game also introduced, as the book explains, it introduced and greatly increased the frequency and the depth of the corruption in the country. That then is connected to how do the people feel about democracy. In the 1990s, there were groups, pockets of policymakers, of course, trained in Russia, in Russian schools, whose careers had been guaranteed because of their knowledge of Russian and the Soviet world, who longed and thought about, I wish we could go back to just holding on to our Russian partner and go back to the old ways. But the old ways in Russia also aren't there anymore. So the Mongols, even the ones who came from that system and benefited from the system, have no longing to go back to communism. Mongolians in general, especially when you look at their domestic policies, are not an ideological people. So that's why when you look at the parties, whether they're called a democratic socialist style party or a democratic party, in reality, they are not ideologically driven. Policy differences domestically are very much based upon the policies and the persona of the figurehead leaders of the parties. And as the leaders take the party in one direction or another, their party members and their supporters amongst the people follow them. Now, when I went to Mongolia the first time in 1975, when it was a full-blown communist country, there were very strange elements in how this communism actually manifested. I was in the Gobi, and of course we had paid money to be tourists to go and be led to see a herder's family. But we were told by the communist guide, you have to wait. We have to go find the herder because he moved last night and we don't know where he is. Now, this is very different than most communist societies, which want to know where everybody is. And as we know in China, where is your hukou? Where do you have the right to live? Well, in a nomadic society, it can't exist like that. So Mongolian communism was not, if you follow the strict economic models of Soviet communism, was not a very strict example of communism. It had structures, but the structures were not suitable for the climate and the ecology of that country. So it was very fungible type of communism. I would say in some way when we look at democracy, is democracy firmly in Mongolia? I would say yes, but again, what version of democracy are we talking about? I personally think that American democracy is not the same as Japanese democracy or as French democracy. So is Mongolian democracy like American democracy? In some ways, more so than European democracy, because every Mongol thinks they should be the political leader. Every Mongol has a position on China or on the latest rules for the traffic in the city of Ulaanbaatar, and they think their views are better than the leadership. So that's very democratic. And Mongolian media, while it can be manipulated, is very free, is very representative of many points of view. So in many ways, Mongolian democracy fits the individuality that a nomadic society forces upon people. When you're a nomad with a herd and you don't have any water for the herd, you can't wait for the government to deliver you the water. You've got to make a decision immediately. And so Mongols, whether they were communist Mongols or so-called democratic Mongols, are in the same place now. If they want to be reliant on government services, the government services don't get out to the countryside, so then the people have to move to Ulaanbaatar, which is why we have one half of the people in Ulaanbaatar, because they put no services in the provincial capitals. So I do think democracy is alive. I also tell my friends in the development community, this is what you asked for. You wanted the Mongolian people to have their views in a parliamentary setting where they express themselves. It just happens that some of the people have views you don't like. They are not happy with the way their government, central government, is selecting mining sites for development or have certain policies connected with trade either to Russia or to China. So like any democratic government, the central authorities have to learn how to convince their people of the wisdom of certain policies or have to amend their policies that reflect the will of the people. And that's all the tension that exists now in Mongolia.
A lot of American politicians or political scientists or commentators observe that democracy is very tough to achieve, and therefore we should excuse countries that are struggling with democracy. Mongolia is the great counterexample. It's a country that went from no democratic tradition to being a very vibrant democracy very quickly. I remember asking a member of the Grand Hurl, the legislature, about what the trick was. How could Mongolia be so successful in that? And he used to notice two things. First, it's relatively homogeneous, except for a 10% Kazakh minority, which they like a lot. Yeah, it's a rather homogeneous society. He said the second great trick was they had the great man in the past. Genghis Khan's kind of it. So any politician today that tries to argue they're the leader of the people or the great leader looks kind of ridiculous compared to Genghis. Could you give us kind of a thumbnail description of Mongolian decision-making? Not a whole civics lesson, but just roughly. How much power does the president have? Is he constrained by the legislature or his ministers or his party or the press?
Well, just like in the U.S. Constitution, we have three competitive, sometimes complementary, and sometimes very individualistic centers of power in our executive, legislative, and judiciary. This is established by the U.S. Constitution, deliberately by the Founding Fathers. And at times, it works well, and in times, and we're in such a time, it doesn't work very well at all. And yet that was the intention, that this tension always be there. Now, one of the great questions is whether this 1992 Constitution is actually a relevant document for Mongolia as it proceeds in the 21st century, or if in fact it is the cause of some of the great friction between the office of the president and the prime minister and his government, because Mongolia chose to have a government with both a prime minister and a president. Well, I was there in 1991 when Mongolia was being pressured by the French, the Americans, the British, the Dutch, on adopting their version of a constitution. And so Mongolia, desperately poor and wanting everybody's money, told the French, I'll take your system, and told the Americans, I'll take your system, and here's the money, please give it to me. And so it took everybody's system and then jammed them together in this bizarre constitutional document, which is full of inconsistencies, but mainly ambiguity. But if a country understands ambiguity, it should be the United States. So 30 years later, we can definitely say one of the major problems or blessings of the Mongolian Constitution is it doesn't strictly define what are the powers of the president versus what are the powers of the prime minister, who is elected from his party through parliamentary elections, but you have a president who is directly elected by the people and stands when they run for the office saying supposedly they belong to no party, but in reality, of course, they come from different parties. So in some ways, this is an advantage because Mongolia can play off different countries by the president says this, but the prime minister says this. And that's particularly happened in the mineral development area. the prime minister has often made promises to the Chinese, to the Koreans, to the Japanese about how his minister of mining is going to act in the sale of mining licenses. But meanwhile, over in the office of the president has the ability, through his connections in the parliament and through his general running of the party, which is in control of the parliament, to muck up the waters and make sure that that bill that the prime minister promised would be passed isn't passed at all. And I'm sure you know many instances. We've had lots of promises. The parliament will ratify this, will change this, and it doesn't happen. And that's because of the way the Constitution is written. So, about 5 years ago, there began to be comments from the parliament, from certain legal scholars, and Mongolia does not have a long legal traditions, at least of civil law, that they should change the parliament. They should change the Constitution, should establish a constitutional convention. But when parties realized that the reason why they have sometimes outsized power and influence is because there's a hole in the Constitution which allows them to do this, they are reluctant to make the changes that all sides would have to make to bring this into compliance. So this initiative, which was rather strong in 2016 and 17, and might have happened if we had a different president, has not gone forward.
It's interesting. Yeah, the international community has been very generous in giving Mongolia lots of advice. They've never been sparing in that. The OSCE told them they should adopt the Irish second preference voting system, which I've had trouble figuring out, but they thought that'd be the best for Mongolia. I've only got 37 more questions, but I'm conscious that we have an audience here that has questions too, so I'll stop with that. Yo?
Perfect. Well, thank you both for a rousing discussion, and I hope to open it up for question and answers. Right here, please.
I'm Peter Humphrey, Intel analyst and a former FSO. I do a lot of predictive intelligence, a specialty in my field. And one of the striking things is that if you're looking at the top 5 winners of global warming, Mongolia is almost certainly in there. But I have no perception at all that the country, A, realizes it, B, has started the academic work to see how its land should be allocated. Do we really want to put a mine here when it might turn out that this is the best agricultural land worked by Bangladeshis whose own country disappeared? That kind of thing. And of course, the foreign policy ramifications of this are awesome, in that Mongolia might be renting out land to other countries, adjacent countries or otherwise. So I'm just wondering if you have any data at all, any feeling at all, that the country knows about this rather optimistic prospect, and have they dedicated any resources to try to plan a little bit, Gosplan, rather than let it just show up 100 years from now? Oh, by the way.
Perhaps we can...
And by the way, the biggest mistake Mongolia is making is using Genghis Khan as their icon. That guy is one of the top 10 mass murderers in history, and I don't know why they keep making that mistake.
Perhaps we can collect one more question. Is there another question? Please. Oh. Go ahead. We'll come back.
Hi, thank you very much for your excellent presentation. I appreciated your slide discussing the relationship between Mongolia and South Korea. I'm just wondering if you could get into more detail comparing Mongolia's relationship with North Korea versus Mongolia's relationship with South Korea.
And one more right here.
Hi, Katie Wang with NTD TV. Can you talk a little bit about the military, the security side, especially the relation between United States and Mongolia? Because we know Secretary Esper just visited the country, and what's the U.S. expectation for Mongolia to play in this Indo-Pacific strategy? Thank you.
Well, we have a very diverse range of questions, so that's interesting. Okay, first of all, let me make my pitch or clarification on why the Mongolians have chosen to put the brand of Chinggis Khan as the major feature to represent their country. First of all, like it or not, the Mongolians have a firm understanding that although their two big neighbors hate their founding father, Chinggis Khan, and he has a very negative reputation in many ways throughout Eurasia, into Europe, that he is the only thing that almost every person that they will meet in a foreign setting has ever heard or knows about Mongolia. So Mongolians are very good at taking what we might think is a negative and turning it into a positive. And a perfect example of this is at the 800th anniversary of the founding of the country by Chinggis Khan and his ascension to the title of Chinggis Khan, they created a statue which sits in the square that is an emulation of the Red Square in front of the Parliament building. And it is not Chinggis Khan the warrior, it is Chinggis Khan the great lawgiver, because he passed down to his people the first set of law codes, which is a fundamental nomadic law code system that has governed Mongolian thinking. And I actually wrote a chapter for an international security book on how Mongolians view law in the post-communist decade. And I said, I can't write this chapter unless you let me write a chapter on traditional Mongolian views of law. And they all emanate from the time of Chinggis Khan and the rules that he passed to his people. So he is promoted in soft power by Mongolia, not as the Russian or the Chinese view of the murderer, but as the lawgiver, the man who listened to his wife. There are these crazy books that say he believed in gender equality. These are promoted by Americans, these theories, not Mongols. Gender equality. He gave females the power to give him counsel, which of course everybody's mother, Caesar's wife, gives him counsel too. But he is promoted in a New York Times bestseller as the first democratic leader in the world. That is an American who said that, a famous professor, not the Mongols. But they said, oh, if the Americans think he's the first democratic leader and change the world, sounds good to me. So they take that idea and promoted it. But going to climate change, Mongols are very interested and very active in the climate change movement, but not in the way that you've expressed it. They look around, and I explain this in the book. It started with the donor assistance era. What are foreign people interested in? They're interested in climate change, okay? Climate change comes with money because we can do research. We have a way to support our university students. We have a way for university people in the summer to have employment. So, okay, we're happy to accept money from the European Union to study climate change. And all of these people studying climate change and funding climate change from outside Mongolia are basically against climate change. Therefore, Mongolia doesn't say, oh, this is how it's going to benefit us. Instead, all of their studies say, these are how many degrees hotter we're going to be. These are the implications for water resources, because they're giving, as I said, they're giving the foreigner, this is a mirror diplomacy concept, they're giving them back what they want to hear. And it's not a lie, but it's instead, if this is going to happen, let's recognize for Mongolia, this may be a good deal. So all the things that you have said would be for some few countries of great positive. Mongolia may understand that, but it is not promoting it because that doesn't give them any money. I hate to say that. Okay, then we go to Mongolia and South Korea, Mongolia and North Korea. Mongolia has had relations with North Korea since 1 month after the founding of the Kim dynasty. It's the second country in the world to recognize the DPRK after the Soviet Union. They also were helpful, very helpful to the leadership of the Politburo during the Korean War by taking their children and the children of generals to be protected and raised in Mongolia during the war. And although the numbers, if you look at the numbers involved, it's only about 200 or so, but because of who these children had as parents, this has had a very lasting impact on a favorable view towards Mongolia by the Kim leadership. And they continuously bring it up. Mongolia used to be economically inferior, let's say in 1990, to the Pyongyang regime. It's not so much that sanctions have caused the deterioration of the North Korean economic situation, it's that Mongolia, which shows why free enterprise works, was a very, very poor developing country in 1990, and about 5 years ago, it is now a lower mid-income country. And it has a lot of mineral resources to develop. So its attitude towards economic principles has split greatly from the North Korean ideas about development and ideology. Mongolians are not ideological, they are personally loyal to people. That's the true with Genghis Khan. They were loyal to him because he beat loyalty into their head. It's not that they followed his, ideological worldview of how Mongolia should be placed on the Eurasian continent. So they also are, and it's very important I discuss this, Mongolia is not a Confucian-based society. So it doesn't care about face, it doesn't care about losing face. If North Korea wants to be elder brother, even though its GDP is much lower now than Mongolia, and its economy is a basket case compared to Mongolia, they don't care. They can be older brother. So they give them honor and respect instead of saying, hey, you didn't do what we did. Look at how much money we have. Mongolians don't act like that. And they don't act like that with China or South Korea or with Myanmar or Kyrgyzstan or Peru. So it's just that's their personality because they don't have the face problem that Confucian-based societies do. So this is why, even though economically we would say roles have reversed between these two countries in 30 years, the Mongols do not act as if the roles have reversed. They still accord the South Korean leadership the respect it so desperately craves. Mongolian security matters in the U.S. relationship. Mongolians had their own empire. Their own empire and connected to what is a superpower in the international world is reflected by military strength. Mongolians in the early 90s, desperately poor, Japan's economy was very good, never thought of Japan as a superpower. Mongolian policymakers told me, any country can be rich, that doesn't mean it's a power. Japan's just rich. It doesn't have a military. Now the US has very limited options about what it actually can trade in an economic sense with Mongolia. We're not going to be buying Mongolian coal or copper. We don't need Mongolian gold or uranium. We have a textile bill in Congress now, which has bipartisan support. We are going to import cashmere textile goods. We can import them from China, we can import them from Britain and Scotland, or we can import them from Mongolia. We're still importing them. So if it moves, this bill helps move manufacturing to Mongolia, that's fine. And it will be reflected in our trade balance. But the heavy minerals that other countries in the region need, particularly South Korea, for example, and Japan, the United States doesn't need. The one exception, rare earth minerals. And rare earth minerals, you don't need to move them in big railroad container cars. But nobody has a rare earth mineral mine open in Mongolia yet. Takes many years to develop such a mine responsibly. So economically, we are not a player now, and we will not be a player economically in the region. But Mongolia isn't defining our power and our status in the world by economics. We're rich, yes, they know that, but we've got military power. And that's why, from the political military point of view, they want a strong relationship with the United States. The United States didn't care so much about this. 2001, which we just memorialized yesterday, changed the dynamics to some extent, because suddenly, in very undeveloped, faraway areas, a threat came, the threat of terrorism. So we have military studies from the US Navy on possibilities of terrorism coming into Western Mongolia, because it was such a remote area that maybe you would have Islamic terrorists go into the Islamic Kazakh areas of Mongolia. Suddenly, people are talking about that. Mongolia has always been part of a great game played by Eurasian powers, England, China, Russia, Japan, on who controls the transportation and transit routes across the continent. The United States was not part of that. But from a global perspective, we certainly understand that our former Cold War enemy and our present main economic rival are the two major areas of Mongolia. So again, we see it as the listening post that other parties a century ago in the Great Games saw Mongolia. So we have smartly understood we can't have an American base in Mongolia because Russia and China will not permit such a thing. But what do? We establish under Donald Rumsfeld a peacekeeper training center for UN peacekeeping. So there you have American soldiers, you have a base of sorts being trained, but the people who are in this base are going to be sent for peacekeeping operations that the UN runs in Somalia, in Rwanda, in Africa, in Iraq, places like this. And so Mongolia has been very interested in upgrading its military in ways that it can, especially in big instruments of warfare, such as planes and major guns from the United States. But it has a very active military relationship with Russia, because if they feel they were ever to be invaded, they're not going to be invaded by the Russians, they're going to be invaded by the Chinese, and they're going to ask their Russian friends to provide them with the rifles and the jeeps so they could go to the front. They say, Americans, we're not interested in your rifles and jeeps, but we want your planes, we want your bigger weapons. So they are keeping their traditional relationship with Russia and military sales that exist before they were barters, but now they're sales. And at the same time, they're solidifying a political military relationship with the United States by also offering to be a bridge to help teach the lessons that Mongolia experienced through this 30 years of transition to other nations in the area, including Vietnam, Myanmar, Kyrgyzstan, on what mistakes were made, what mistakes were not, what things didn't turn out to be mistakes, or how to do it your own way. Mongolia teaches some of these developing countries or ex-socialist authoritarian countries, you can stay your own special way with your own special nationalistic system and still be more integrated into the world. That's the message it's also trying to tell North Korea. So this, for various reasons at different times, becomes important to the United States. We have an administration now interested in moving on Korean Peninsula issues. If we, as an administration, are less interested in this, for whatever reason, then the importance, military importance, political importance of Mongolia will recede, and this will affect our military and political relationship.
Thank you, Dr. Campi. I think that was a very incredibly comprehensive discussion, and I'd like to thank both Dr. Campi and our discussant, Mark Tokola,
Can I
for...
just stick in 3 quick footnotes?
Yes.
Just very quickly. First, the Mongolians know both Koreas very well. A lot of Mongolians attended Kim Il-sung University in Pyongyang, so they know the place. The current head of the UN agencies in South Korea is Mongolian, Master Gonbold. So they're well connected. Second, one Mongolian general I spoke to said we need to think of it differently for Mongolia. They're not interested in territorial sovereignty. Their notion is sovereignty of the people, the Hulk. So they're not worried about protecting every inch of that border, which makes sense for a country that spills over both in Russia and China. Mongolians are well beyond Mongolia's borders. So as long as they can protect their people, they're not worried about land. It's a different concept. And third, Time magazine named Genghis Khan the man of the millennium.
Well, with that final, very informative footnotes, if you would join me in congratulating Dr. Campi for the publication of her book and thanking her for her time.